At my cousin's wedding, my uncle demanded, "You're just here to take photos and not to eat." Then I observed my $4,400 gift had already been opened. I quietly picked it up and disappeared. I, 32M, never thought family could be this cruel until my cousin's wedding day turned into the most humiliating experience of my life. What started as a gesture of love and generosity ended with me walking away from people I'd called family for over 3 decades. My cousin had always been close to me growing up. We'd spent countless summers together, shared secrets, and I genuinely considered him more like a brother than a cousin. When his wedding invitation arrived 6 months ago, I was thrilled. The venue was upscale, the guest list extensive, and everything screamed expensive celebration. Being a freelance photographer, I'd been struggling financially for the past year. Several clients had defaulted on payments, and my equipment needed urgent upgrades. Despite my tight budget, I wanted to give something meaningful. After weeks of deliberation, I decided on a professional camera lens worth $4,400, something I knew he'd appreciate since he'd recently gotten into photography as a hobby. It meant emptying my savings and putting the remainder on my credit card, but family comes first, right? The morning of the wedding, I carefully wrapped the lens in elegant packaging and wrote a heartfelt note about our childhood memories and my wishes for his future. I arrived at the venue early, wanting to help with any last-minute arrangements. The country club was stunning, with manicured gardens and crystal chandeliers that sparkled in the afternoon sun. I placed my gift on the designated table, making sure it was secure among the other presents. The table was already filling up with beautifully wrapped boxes and envelopes. I felt proud seeing my gift there, knowing the sacrifice it represented. As guests began arriving, I noticed my uncle, the father of the groom, directing staff and making arrangements. He'd always been the authoritative type, successful in business, and used to being in charge. Our relationship had been cordial, but never particularly warm. He viewed me as the struggling artist of the family, often making subtle comments about my career choices. The ceremony was beautiful. Watching my cousin exchange vows brought tears to my eyes. During the cocktail hour, I mingled with relatives I hadn't seen in years, catching up on family news and genuinely enjoying myself. The photographer they'd hired was busy capturing moments, and I found myself appreciating the technical aspects of his work. When dinner was announced, guests began moving toward the reception hall. The seating arrangement was elegant, with round tables adorned with white linens and centerpieces. I looked for my name on the seating chart, scanning each table carefully. My name wasn't listed anywhere. Confused, I approached one of the venue coordinators and explained the situation. She checked her list twice before informing me that I wasn't on the guest list for dinner. My stomach dropped. This had to be a mistake. I found my uncle near the head table, discussing something with the venue manager. When I approached him about the seating confusion, his response nearly knocked me over. He told me, quite matter-of-factly, that I was just there to take photos and not to eat. He explained that they'd assumed I was working as an additional photographer and that dinner wasn't included for vendors. The words hit me like a physical blow. I tried to explain that I was a guest, not hired help, that I'd received a formal invitation like everyone else. But he dismissed my protest with a wave of his hand, suggesting that if I wanted to eat, I could grab something from the kitchen staff's meal later. I stood there, humiliated, as other guests filed past me into the dining area. Some relatives I'd been chatting with earlier looked confused when I wasn't following them to dinner. The shame burned in my chest as I realized what was happening. Somehow, in their minds, I'd been relegated from family member to unpaid service provider. Needing a moment to collect myself, I walked toward the gift table to clear my head. What I saw there made my blood run cold. My carefully wrapped present was sitting there, but something was wrong. The wrapping paper had been carefully removed and replaced, but not quite perfectly. The edges didn't line up the way I'd left them, and the ribbon was tied differently. My hands shook as I lifted the box. It felt lighter. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then carefully opened one corner. The expensive lens was gone. In its place was a cheap, plastic toy camera, the kind you'd find in a dollar store. The realization hit me like a truck. Not only had they excluded me from dinner and treated me like hired help, but someone had actually stolen my gift and replaced it with garbage. The $4,400 I couldn't afford to spend, the months of saving, the genuine love and thought I'd put into choosing something special, all of it had been thrown back in my face. I looked around the reception area, Watching my family members laughing and enjoying themselves at tables I wasn't welcome to join. My cousin was beaming at the head table, probably having no idea what his father had done. Other relatives were toasting and celebrating, oblivious to the fact that one of their own had just been publicly humiliated and robbed. The anger that rose in me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't just about the money, though that stung terribly. It was about the complete disrespect, the casual cruelty, the way they'd reduced me to nothing in their eyes. I was family, but apparently only when it was convenient for them. I made my decision in that moment. Quietly, calmly, I picked up the box containing the toy camera. I walked back toward the reception area where my uncle was now seated at the head table, raising a glass in a toast to the happy couple. Instead of making a scene, I chose a different path. I walked directly to my uncle's seat and placed the open box in front of him, right on his dinner plate. The cheap plastic camera tumbled out, clattering against his wine glass. The conversations around the head table stopped as everyone stared at the toy. I leaned down close to his ear and quietly informed him that if I wasn't good enough to eat with the family, then I wasn't good enough to give gifts either. I told him he could keep his replacement present since it seemed more fitting for the level of respect I'd been shown. The color drained from his face as he realized what had happened. Other family members at the table were looking confused, trying to understand the significance of the toy camera. My cousin started to ask what was going on, but I was already walking away. I didn't run. I didn't storm out dramatically. I simply walked with dignity toward the exit, my head held high despite the crushing disappointment in my chest. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispered conversations starting at the head table, but I didn't look back. As I reached my car, my phone was already buzzing with calls and texts. I turned it off and drove home in silence, the weight of what had happened settling over me like a heavy blanket. Update 1. The aftermath began almost immediately. By the time I got home, my landline was ringing constantly. I let it go to voicemail, not ready to deal with the explanations and justifications I knew were coming. The first message was from my cousin, sounding confused and asking me to call him back. The second was from my aunt, my uncle's wife, demanding I explain my inappropriate behavior at the reception. The third was from my uncle himself, his voice tight with controlled anger as he accused me of causing a scene and ruining his son's wedding day. I listened to each message with growing disbelief. In their version of events, I was the villain. There was no acknowledgement of how I'd been treated, no mention of the stolen gift, no recognition that maybe, just maybe, they'd done something wrong. Over the next few days, the family phone tree lit up. Relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly had opinions about my behavior. Some called to get the gossip, others to take sides. The story being circulated was that I'd disrupted the wedding reception with some kind of tantrum over seating arrangements. My cousin finally reached me on the fourth day. He sounded genuinely confused and hurt, asking why I'd embarrassed him at his wedding. When I explained what had actually happened, the exclusion from dinner, the stolen gift, the replacement toy, there was a long silence on the phone. He told me he'd had no idea about the seating situation, that he'd assumed I was seated somewhere and hadn't thought to check. As for the gift, he claimed complete ignorance. He'd opened presents the morning after the wedding and found the toy camera, but assumed it was some kind of inside joke he didn't understand. I asked him pointedly who had access to the gift table and who would have known the value of what I'd brought. The silence stretched longer this time. Finally, he admitted that his father had been very involved in managing all the wedding details, including keeping an eye on the gifts for security purposes. My cousin promised to look into it, to ask his father directly about what had happened, but I could hear the conflict in his voice. He was caught between his new wife's family politics, his father's influence, and whatever loyalty he might still feel toward me. Update 2. 2 weeks passed before I heard from my cousin again. When he finally called, his tone had changed completely. He was formal, distant, like he was reading from a script. He told me that after discussing everything with his father, they determined that there must have been some misunderstanding about the dinner arrangements, and that these things sometimes happened at large events. As for the gift, he claimed his father had no knowledge of any camera lens and suggested that perhaps I'd been mistaken about what I'd brought or where I'd placed it. He said the toy camera had been in a box with my name on it, so they'd assumed that's what I'd intended to give. The gaslighting was so blatant it took my breath away. They were rewriting history, making me question my own memory and experience. The $4,400 lens had somehow never existed in their version of events. The deliberate exclusion from dinner had become an innocent misunderstanding. But the most painful part came at the end of the conversation. My cousin told me that given the disruption I'd caused at his wedding and my apparent tendency toward dramatic outbursts, he thought it would be best if we took some time apart. He suggested that maybe in the future, when emotions had cooled down, we could rebuild our relationship. I was being cut off, excommunicated. The victim was being punished while the perpetrators closed ranks and protected each other. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. It cost me money I didn't have, but I needed to know the truth. I gave him all the details: the venue, the timeline, my uncle's involvement with gift security, the mysterious appearance of the toy camera. What he found 3 weeks later changed everything. The venue had security cameras covering the gift area. The private investigator, working with a contact at the facility, was able to access footage from the wedding day. The video clearly showed my uncle approaching the gift table during the cocktail hour, locating my present by reading the name tags, and carefully unwrapping it. The footage showed him examining the camera lens, putting it in a small bag he'd brought, and then rewrapping the box with the toy camera inside. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, and he'd done it with the casual efficiency of someone who'd planned it in advance. But the most damning part was what happened next. The video showed my uncle walking to his car in the parking lot and placing the bag with my lens inside. He'd stolen my gift and planned to keep it for himself. Armed with this evidence, I had a choice to make. I could take the video to the police and press charges for theft. I could share it with the family and expose the truth. Or I could use it as leverage for a different kind of justice. Update 3. I chose the nuclear option. I took the security footage and created a detailed timeline of events. I wrote out everything that had happened that day, supported by video evidence and witness statements from venue staff who remembered the incident. Then I compiled it all into a comprehensive document. But instead of going to the police first, I sent copies to every family member who had attended the wedding. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. Everyone got the full story with video proof of the theft. The response was swift and decisive. My uncle's reputation in the family had always been built on his success and respectability. The idea that he would steal from his own nephew, especially at his son's wedding, was so beyond the pale that even his closest supporters couldn't defend it. My aunt called me within hours of receiving the package, sobbing and apologizing for her husband's behavior. She'd apparently confronted him immediately, and he'd broken down and confessed everything. The camera lens was in his home office, still in its original packaging. The family dynamics shifted overnight. Relatives who had shunned me after the wedding were now calling to apologize and express their outrage at what had really happened. My uncle found himself isolated and facing demands that he make full restitution. But I wasn't done yet. I took the evidence to the police and filed theft charges. The value of the stolen item made it a felony in our state. I also contacted my uncle's employer, a prestigious financial firm where reputation was everything, and provided them with copies of the security footage. The professional consequences were immediate. My uncle was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. His clients, many of whom were also family friends, began questioning whether they could trust someone who would steal from his own family. My cousin tried to reach out multiple times, but I ignored his calls. The time for explanations and family diplomacy had passed. He'd chosen his side when he'd helped cover up his father's crime and then tried to gaslight me into believing it had never happened. The legal process moved forward. My uncle's lawyer contacted me about a plea agreement, but I refused all settlement offers. I wanted this to go to trial. I wanted a public record of what had happened. In the end, my uncle pleaded guilty to avoid the spectacle of a trial. He was sentenced to community service and ordered to pay restitution of 3 times the value of the stolen item, $13,200 total. The criminal conviction also triggered the morality clause in his employment contract, and he was terminated from his job. But the real justice came from the family's response. My uncle went from being the respected patriarch to a pariah. Invitations stopped coming. Holiday gatherings happened without him. His own siblings distanced themselves from the embarrassment he'd brought on the family name. My cousin's marriage suffered too. His new wife's family had questions about what kind of people they'd allied themselves with. The wedding they'd spent so much money on was now remembered not for its elegance, but for the theft and cover-up that followed. I took the $13,200 restitution payment and used it to upgrade all my photography equipment. Business picked up as word spread about my situation. Apparently, there was something appealing about hiring the photographer who'd stood up to family bullies and won. The last I heard, my uncle was working at a much smaller firm for a fraction of his previous salary. My cousin had stopped trying to contact me entirely. The family gatherings I'd once looked forward to were no longer part of my life, but I found I didn't miss the drama and toxicity as much as I'd expected. 6 months later, I realized something important. I was happier. The people who had shown their true colors that day had done me a favor by revealing themselves. The family members who really mattered, the ones who had reached out to apologize and support me, those relationships had actually grown stronger. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let people treat you as less than you're worth and making sure there are real consequences for their actions. The $4,400 I'd lost had bought me something far more valuable. The knowledge of who my real family was and the self-respect that comes from standing up for yourself when it matters most. My uncle had thought he could steal from me and dismiss me because he saw me as powerless. He learned the hard way that being family doesn't give you the right to abuse someone, and that sometimes the quiet ones hit back the hardest when they finally had enough. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.